I'm Dave Harries. I joined Abbey Road in 1964, and during that period, of course, EMI were having fantastic number of hits. Abbey Road was churning out number ones week after week after week, and not only were we doing the pop records, we were also doing classical music. And at that time, it was basically 4-track recording, and then went on to 8-track. And then in 1970, George Martin asked me to join him at their studios that I worked for 25 years. But the years at Abbey Road were fantastic because of the records that we made. I mean, every single massive record was done there at that time, during that period of time. And very proud of, the work that we all did as engineers at the studio.
Hi, I'm Chris Thomas. I didn't actually work for EMI or Abbey Road Studios. I started off in 1968 working for George Martin, and that's how I first met Dave at Abbey Road. And then, of course, in 1970, when Air Studios started, I did the very first session there, and then I carried on working. That was my sort of studio of choice for good way over 20 years. Since then, Dave's been at places like British Grove, which I've also used. So we've kind of followed each other around since the end of the 60s.
But I was a technical engineer at Abbey Road, and I always wanted to work in the studio because I love music and I love building hi-fi and amplifiers and stuff like that. So the first place that I worked actually was at Hayes in the tape records department, where we did small 3¼ inch reels, half-track mono tapes, including all the Beatles things and everything, including classical music, even its 3¾ inch half-track tape. And then after working there for a while, I heard that there was a chap called Peter Lindsay who worked at Abbey Road. I heard he was leaving. He came and told me, I'm leaving, so there'll be a job. So I applied and I got the job there, and that was fantastic to get a job there, because I always used to hear Manfred Mann, 54321, and I thought that was the most fantastic record, and I wanted to go to the studio where that was recorded.
Well, I started by actually, I got to the point, I really wanted to be a record producer more than anything else in the world. I absolutely had my heart set on it. And so I wrote to George Martin because I thought that would probably be the best. In actual fact, I didn't even ask him for a job. I actually asked him for some advice, saying that I wanted to do this. And he ended up giving me an interview, and then he ended up giving me basically a roof to, in the sense of like joining Air London. And so from there, it wasn't just George Martin that was there, but also John Burgess, who produced Manfred Mann. Ron Richards, who did all the Hollies records for a start. So I think the very first session I went to at Abbey Road was a Hollies session. So yeah, that was my introduction to Abbey Road. The one thing I do remember is like when I was making records, he used to come in and he used to go like, he said, "That sounds like a hit." And he kept doing it for a long time. So it was very encouraging, very encouraging.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were technical. We gave him the tools to make a good record.
Yeah.
So it's funny thing about studios, all the studios, we used to work for, when I was at Air, for example, or when I was at Abbey Road, we did jobs for other people. We did jobs for, EMI did jobs for Decca, Decca did jobs for EMI. We did jobs for all the record companies. And it was amazing because you were actually working, if you think about it, for the competition, right? By making but you always did your very best to make sure that that record was the best it could be. So if he was working for Air, or he was working for Chris Thomas Limited, or he was working for Wessex, or wherever he was working for, he was trying to get the best out of that record. But for us as a studio, we were trying to provide him with the best thing we could to make the record very saleable and sound great as well, of course.
In the early 60s, this is where studio technology, in terms of like translating ideas, just going away from the purely technical, where people were like coming up with ideas, and then the tech department would be able to bring those ideas to fruition. So that was just an amazing, this was almost like when the alphabet was being written.
It was a real teamwork as well. And we were all big mates. I mean, we had a laugh. I know some producers didn't like me coming in the control room because I came in. Then there's obviously a problem. So to be a producer, he wouldn't have known that the engineer could hear a crackling on channel 66, right? So the engineer wouldn't tell him, oh bugger it, I've got a noise on channels, but they tell me, or they tell someone in the technical department. You go in and you go to the engineer and say, what's the problem? He'd say, oh, there's a noise on. And I wouldn't want him to know about it because he's only worried about the musical result. It didn't worry him, but if it was a fault, it might waste a bit of time and you'd have to pay more for the session. We all worked together to try and make it as good as possible for the artist to be able to perform and not think that there was a problem going on.
In fact, in terms of that, it was really the artist that was that wouldn't know really about that technical fault, because that would really interrupt stuff. Well, the point about the equipment is like you get to learn what each particular thing does. So how can you use that in a musical way? So you understand exactly what the frequencies, how the frequencies are corresponding to the instruments, compressors, different forms of echo that you can use, just so that you can employ all these things to change and manipulate the sound or bring out the sound. It's just basically the equipment is your paint box.
But the other thing that was very difficult for studios to manage was the upgrading of the standards of the equipment and the change from, like when at Abbey Road, as I said, I was there for that period of time. We went from 4-track to 8-track, and then when we went to air, it was 16-track, just coming in at that time. So therefore the studios were in a bit of a quandary as to know which piece of equipment and when to buy it, because it was all expensive. And the other thing was, of course, the mixing consoles got bigger and bigger and basically had more and more facilities on them. So you had to try and keep up with that. And then there was the other thing of fashion, because you had a fashion thing about mixers. You had this SSL in here, but then a lot of people wanted SSL, other people wanted Neve, there were Cadacs, there were all sorts of manufacturers of equipment. So when you had a point where you had to buy certain equipment that you may not have really liked to keep up with fashion, because that's what the record companies and the producers are asking you to be able to use for their records. So, it was a bit of a quandary for studios to keep up to date. And of course, we always wanted to try what we thought was the best equipment, because then you wanted to attract people like Chris Thomas into your studio, top producer. You had a thing about EMI where they made their own equipment, but the very foolish thing where EMI made a massive mistake was that they wouldn't sell it to competition. So they had the lead. EMI had the lead in console design, probably in the world. In terms of the audio equipment, I mean, that big desk, the TG desk, that was very famous, that did Abbey Road and was the big transistor desk that was built and designed by EMI. Even George Harrison wanted to buy one for his studio. They wouldn't even sell him one. But at the time, of course, it was fantastic. At the time, it led to that studio being the best in the world. There was nothing else to touch it. I'm not even sure, did they sell any equipment to Capitol, to their subsidiaries? They certainly had those mixers. They had studios in every town in the world, every big city in the world. I remember going to a professional exhibition of equipment. I'm not quite sure when it was. And all I saw, it was probably an AES. It wasn't APRS, it was AES somewhere with Malcolm, who was my chief tech at Air. And I went there and all I saw was screens, right, with bloody faders on the screens and no mixers. And I said to Malcolm, I'm out of here, this is a load of crap. If this is going to be what it's like, that's me finished. And we had that situation where everybody thought that, you were going to have, which you do have faders on the screens, but you still have proper faders. And that's where it came back, the fact that you need that interaction of fingers and movement to get the sound right. Not on a screen and pressing a button saying it's up or down and all that, which I thought was coming. And the way these people were showing all this equipment, because so many people had it, I said, oh no, that's it, that's the end, I'm off. But no, it came back, fortunately. People saw sense and realised that you do sound with your fingers, not with looking at a screen and pressing a button in and out 4 times. Digital came along, and some people didn't like that. I could see how useful it was, but I didn't necessarily like the sound.
It's very difficult now if you're working on a record. This has happened a couple of times where you're not necessarily working on a desk. An engineer who's used to sort of doing stuff himself, he's got his computer there and he's doing everything on computer. So if you're working with an engineer like that, it's incredibly limiting, because I've got to say, try putting the voice up 1 dB to see what it sounds like. You're not sitting there and playing the thing as you go along, and all the time you're just having to instruct somebody to do something, so it takes far longer to do anything. And it's incredibly restrictive. Whereas when you've got because I always used to, when I make a record, I kind of start mixing the very moment we're actually putting the track down, so that this is a monitor panel for me. So I start to sort of play around with you start to play around with the balance of the whole song, and just unconsciously through the course of the day you're just moving stuff a little bit, so that at the end of the day everything's starting to sit, and then from there that will inspire the overdub ideas that you might have. So in actual fact, by the time I've actually finished recording a title, it's pretty well mixed as well. It's all done and dusted. So to actually sort of dissemble that and then have somebody, or to do it, not to have that facility taken away, and to have to actually try to verbally tell an engineer this up, that down, because I'm not working the computer. It's bonkers, really. The funny thing is, when you've got sort of 48 tracks, it's like, how on earth did anybody make a record on 2 tracks or 4 tracks? Out of every restriction, because necessity is the mother of invention, but you find a way to fix that problem.
Because if you had only 4 track, for example, you had to make your mind up a lot quicker as to what was good and what was bad. Whereas, people now, and they still do it, they'll spend a day comping a bass track. Now, what is the point of that? Some of the best-selling records are still just 4 tracks and 2 tracks, as you know.
I always say that you can make a good record anywhere if you get to know the equipment. If it means that the plugins give facility for people to make records, and especially if in a situation where it's not going to be as expensive for them, then that's great, because it opens the doors to more people to be able to work. So you can make a good record with anything. Your ear reference is to, when you're making a record, is to what sounds good to your brain, and so you go to achieve that particular sound that's in your head, and you'll find a way of doing it. So it doesn't really matter if it's a real Fairchild or it's not in the end.
You get the sound to fit the project, really, don't you? I mean, you can go into a symphony orchestra, right? And then the next day you can go into the same symphony orchestra in the same place with the same mics. Sounds completely different. Work that out.
Barometric pressure.
Something very silly. But it happens.
If you get to know, that's what I said about if you know the equipment, if you get to know your speaker, and you get to know the room that you're in, because it doesn't matter, you can put that speaker in another room, it sounds completely different. If you get to know what you're actually listening in a room, then that's the most important thing. Because the worst thing that can ever happen in your life when you're making a record is you make this record and you've had a great day and it's a great session and it sounds wonderful, and you take it home and it sounds absolutely fucking terrible. And you go, what? Where do we go here? And actually there was a case in point that this did happen. In a big way. It was Roxy Music's Viva album, which was the live album, and I was mixing it, and I was mixing the record, finished the whole record without actually referring it to any other studios or anywhere else. Finished the record and then took it into one of the other studios and listened to it went into number 1 and had a listen. It sounded bloody terrible. I thought, what the hell's going on here? Went up to number 2 and it sounded terrible. It's like, we've got a problem here. So this was at about 2 o'clock in the morning. So we had to speak to Mr. Harris about this. So we've got a serious problem here. Can you help us? And he came in and he said, well, what's the problem? And I said, but we're mixing here. We've done this. He said, well, what speakers do you use? And I said, well, the 2 speakers up there. He said, you're not supposed to use those. I went, what? We've been here for like about 3 weeks. What do you mean you're not supposed to use the speakers? Why didn't somebody say something? And he actually saved the whole album because it was in the dump. I mean, we were completely buggered. And he came in with his favourite thing, which was to put white noise into the control room and measure everything. And he worked out where this thing had all gone completely wrong, came in with a, graphic equalizer, inverted everything. We recorded it through that, went into number 1, listened to it, sounded fantastic. When I first go into a studio to start, say, a new album, the first thing I concentrate on is making sure that, obviously we've got to make sure that everything's working all right, but more importantly, make sure that everybody's comfortable with the way they're being able to hear and watch everybody else. So there's good sight lines so that people can see the drummer, even if it's just a peripheral sort of thing. And I really concentrate on just purely the mechanics of everything, rather than thinking about the song at this point. Until everything starts to sort of settle down, and then bit by bit, the song starts to unfold and the takes start to unfold. So then you can sort of move on from there. But first and foremost, the most important thing is just to make sure that there's just so that you can actually then move quickly. You don't want to suddenly find out that somebody's actually had a bit of a problem with his headphones and when you want to start working quickly, somebody's got a problem and they haven't actually said anything about it. So just make sure that everything is just nice and smooth.
You've got to be prepared to take a lot of bumps along the way.
That's for
and
sure.
you've got to work your arse off. You've got to be prepared to work 24 hours non-stop without moaning. And you can't moan, and you must keep your trap shut at the right time. You mustn't say something that's going to annoy somebody else in the control room when the artists are in there, and you just keep your crap shut and do your job as best you can.
Well, you've got to follow you've got to follow your dream. You've got to follow what you believe, because you're really trying to reach for something so you've got to please everybody else, and you've got to please yourself.
And put yourself in a position where you're going to end up with a bit of luck one day, because and you'll only do that by sticking at the job. You stick at the job, one day that engineer won't turn up. His wife's broken a leg or he's got COVID. So you've got to sit there and do that. And that's your big chance. You've got to wait for that break, and then you can do it.